Oh, thank you all for coming. I feel like I'm in a radio studio with all this stuff spread out around me and my headphones so I can actually hear. And I do have notes, which is what you see me glancing at because I can't remember. I have to say this was very interesting. I talked to Libby yesterday and said, you know, usually when you do a resume or reflect on your life, you're either writing an obituary or you're applying for a job. And since I haven't written my obituary, it was kind of an odd thing not to be writing to get something, to move up or to acquire, you know, a seat somewhere. And so being able to step back allowed me to see where Unitarian Universalism came into my life before I even had a name for it, and how much the tribe of UUs has meant in my life when I just move away and look at my life holistically. So I think I'll just get started. And I do have some pictures, which I will share. I'm going to share a few at the beginning, and then I'll have more that I'd like to share at the end. So I put a timer on so I can kind of introduce my family. So my father was born in Huntsville, Alabama, and in 1909, and my mother was born in Toronto, Canada, as was my grandfather, as was my great-grandfather, as was my great-great-grandfather was not born in Canada, but immigrated to Toronto in 1835. That's pre-Civil War. And he owned a business in Virginia and had been alerted that the Klan was, you know, rising. That was, you know, a time when there was a lot of unrest in the United States. And he took his family and moved to Toronto in 1835. And he had $700 in his pocket. So he was considered quite a wealthy man. So he came to Toronto as a man of means and started buying properties. And by the time he died, he owned 75 properties. But I was burdened with that history as a child because it made me different. All right, my mother was very Canadian. I was raised very Canadian, and that's one of the things that Ann Perry and I have in common, is that Canadian background and aesthetic. And within the Black community, I was always teased because I was a little bit different and had a little different way of looking at the world, as anybody who's interacted with Canadians knows. They have a different point of view. And I was always called in the Black community an Elite. And I'm going to circle back to that, but I was always called an Elite. And that was a pejorative term, that, you know, that I had this background and lived on this street and did these things and so on and so forth. And so it was just a bad name. It wasn't what you really wanted to be called. But I survived it. I had a great childhood. My mother was 37 when I was born, so I learned to deal with adults. I didn't have a lot of childhood friends. I had mostly adults because her peers had children that were 10 years older than I was. So I got dragged to everything. At 7 years old, I could play a full game of canasta when we visited Highland Beach in Washington during the summers. I could play pinochle by the time I was 11, and blackjack, could actually win money at blackjack because I was just used to being around adults. But I got sent off to boarding school when I was in the 9th grade, and that was Windsor Mountain School. And for those that are teachers, you'll know that was the height of the open classroom and the experimental education and so on and so forth. There, of course, was Miss Halls that taught young ladies how to be young ladies. But I went to the hippie school where the leadership of the school made the academic rules and the students made all the other rules, which meant we had no rules. There were no locked doors. The dorms were segregated, but the doors were never locked. So people who wanted to wander out at night and connect with their boyfriend or whatever, that was not frowned upon. I smoked at 13. I was going to school with a lot of people from New York, particularly people in the arts who were being persecuted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Younger people don't really know what that is, but many of you do remember McCarthyism and the persecution of artists and so on and so forth. But this school was very unique. It was founded by German Jews who had left Germany as the Nazis began to rise. And their model was that students should take responsibility and should direct their own education. and that the fewer rules you had, the happier and better product you got at the end. And they bought the Grenville Winthrop estate in Lenox, Massachusetts, which was 150 acres. And Winthrop was, of course, the first governor of Massachusetts. So this was a huge piece of property. And that's where I spent my formative years, was in boarding school. They had scholarship students from New York and from all over the world. There was a young woman that was fleeing the Hungarian Revolution. We had students from 3 or 4 countries in Africa, Ghana and Liberia, and so on and so forth. We had people from Germany who at that point in the 1960s, 59 to 63, were, sort of the aftermath, the second generation of persecuted Jews from Germany. So this was kind of a United Nations, and we would play soccer with the other Groton and Phillips Exeter, all the schools and we would have this multicolor soccer team. And of course, because they were all Europeans, they were excellent soccer players. And I think Windsor Mountain had a great deal to do with why Phillips Exeter and Groton and Miss Halls and all the prep schools that were around us, which in 1959 were all white, suddenly started developing an international program and invited students from all over the world. Because by the time I graduated, those soccer teams from the other schools were integrated. I was not a scholarship student, which was actually a stroke of brilliance. There were 3 or 4 Black families that sent kids to this school who were full tuition. And then there were students that were on a free ride, and that was just the way it worked. So people didn't know who was who, and that was before even the language of affirmative action. So I grew up, I was smoking at 13. I gave up the broad in my sophomore year. I did anti-Vietnam stuff. We would go to New York and protest the Vietnam War. As I said, there was a lot of discussion and concern around HUAC, and a lot of the students were there for their protection because their parents were being hounded. And so I would come home from this prep school with all these kind of progressive, what we would say very Unitarian ideas. And my friends would again say, you're an Elite, and you're just crazy. You got all these white ideas. What are you talking about, HUAC? What are you talking about, the Vietnam War? Because they were living in their own little bubble. And so when I learned to drive, there was a big article in the Detroit Free Press about the Unitarian Church there. And I thought, oh, I'm looking at these principles and thinking, these sound like kind of Windsor Mountain folks, They did a lot of social justice work. And so I drove myself to the Unitarian Church, which was being held in a large auditorium. And I walked in, and as would be typical in the late 50s, my brown face just kind of got stares. And I thought, okay, I love the idea of this church, but this doesn't look like a group that's going to be friendly to me. And I literally just walked out and thought, well, that's too bad, because I really liked the ideas, but it just didn't click for me. So I went back to school and graduated from high school, went to college, picked up a couple of degrees, picked up a husband, had some kids, had 2 boys, one of which is sort of hanging around the Unitarian Church. And I'm very proud of them. They've done very well. It was not easy to raise Black children and keep them, on the right track, focused on education, focused on civic engagement during that time, or even now, even harder now. And then I think I joined the Junior League, and I met, and because of my work with the Junior League of Rochester, which is where I know Joe Cohn from, we were in the Junior League together. I think it's Joe and Robin, not Robin. Anyway, there's another member of the church that I knew from those days. Anyway, I worked with a young woman named Jama Dobson for 2 years at the YWCA. She was president when I was on the board and vice president. And she all of a sudden was featured in this big article in the DNC that they had hired a minister for First Universalist Church, and that was Reverend Beth Banks, who is now in Davis, California. And that she was featured because it was the search committee, the big splash of the new minister. And I thought, oh, well, I think a lot of James, so I'm going to go to this church. And lo and behold, I found out that Jama was married to a black man. I had worked closely with her for 2 years, had no idea that she was married to a black man and had a biracial child. We were just working on women's Y stuff. So I started going to First Universalist, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is fabulous, because here is a community of people where I don't feel like I'm different, that when you're talking about these things, values and worrying about social justice issues, that people got it. And they were even more engaged in social justice work than I was. And so that was sort of the first time I actually felt like I fit in. I met my second husband there, Leeuw, and Beth married us. And, you know, I was teaching school in Brighton and doing mostly parenting and working, and then started getting involved in the community. And so I was working with the YW, I was still with the Junior League, I joined Planned Parenthood's board and became a treasurer, and all the while, the Unitarian Church, I was working there too and loving my time there, just like I've loved my time at First Unitarian. But finally feeling at home, that people were just not critical, and in fact, I was the slouch in the group. Everybody else seemed to be doing so much. And so I was really pushed and empowered to get busy and and have service be my prayer, which was part of the chalice ending or chalice lighting of First Universalist at that time. That, you know, there's a prayer that says something to the effect that service was your prayer. And I took that very literally. And so in the meantime, as I said, I picked up husband number 2, Leeuw, and acquired 2 stepchildren, one of whom is currently an Episcopal priest, but one was still at home. And so I married a guy with a 14-year-old. And he is actually it was terrific. But he grew up very differently than my own children, who were very channeled toward education and, you know, staying out of trouble and being engaged. He was very much a Unitarian child, a free spirit. And I had to get used to the fact that Hendrik didn't have like curfews or anything like that. And so I became Kabir's father's wife. I decided I would not take on the role of stepmother. I would just be Kabir's father's wife, second wife. And I was not Kabir's mother, I was his father's wife. And so that worked out pretty well. Kabir turned out to be a really terrific kid, and, you know, got through college after his father died, and, you know, is now happily married in New York and working for the American Psychoanalytic Association, and his brother's a priest. And my kids are, one's the Navy son, the military son that I speak of so often, is a commander in the US Navy, and Omar, who you have seen darting through the church occasionally, and his partner Wendy and her son are members of our community. And I'll show you pictures of them later. So that was all. I was still downtown during that time. And then after my husband died, it got really difficult to be there. The match of the minister at that time was not a good match for me. And I kept saying, you know, I've worked with all kinds of people. I can work with all kinds of people. The bottom line was I stopped going to church and thought, okay, this just can't happen, because this was really my tribe. And so I started coming to First Unitarian. And by that time I was on Jiva's board, and I was on RACF. And so I'd walk into the Rochester Area Community Foundation meeting, and there are 20 people sitting around the room, and I'm looking around, and I knew a few people that I knew. And then I looked at this guy and thought, gosh, he looks familiar. And he's staring at me and, you know, kind of like, you know, do I know you? And so after the meeting, we're trying to connect, and I'm saying, I feel like I know you. And so we went through the usual things. Do you live in Brighton? Did you have kids? You know, did you do this? No. We couldn't make a connection at all. Couldn't figure it out. But we kept thinking, yeah, but we knew each other. Like, I felt like I knew him. It took me 6 meetings before I realized that he was a member of First Unitarian. But he was going to the 11 o'clock service, and I was either in the early service or the Saturday service at that point. It was Dick Schwartz. And I happened to stay after one day, and there was Dick, and it was like, oh my God, look at this. Oh, here's my healthcare provider. Oh, here's this. And so this whole world of the 11 o'clock service kind of surrounded me. And it's like, no wonder I liked you. That was Carol Teal. All right. And so all these people in my life, the other life, had no idea they were Unitarians until I started hanging around the 11 o'clock service and realized they were all coming to church at First Unitarian. And yet we had connected in another way. So again, it was like feeling this was my tribe. You know, these people are all doing fabulous things. And again, I'm the slouch here. You know, I'm just doing this and doing that. And everybody's doing all these big things. So, you know, that really is, the Unitarians really empowered me and mentored me and became my tribe and allowed me to take risks. And I'm just really grateful to be a Unitarian. So my alarm just went off, which meant I've run my mouth for 15 minutes. So I'd like to actually show you some pictures. My great-great-grandfather, the one that I told you came to Toronto, actually his son, whose picture is right here. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. And I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to share my 5-year-old community. But this is William Peyton Hubbard. He became the first Black doctor who graduated from the University of Toronto. This is my mother's grandfather. And the other picture of the gentleman he was the first Black elected politician in Canada. And he was on the council and was actually number 2. So he was the head of the council, and he was the acting mayor when the mayor couldn't do stuff. They didn't have an acting mayor position, but the president of the council did that. And here's another picture of him. So he's kind of a distinguished, and we sort of have a genetic trait that you can kind of see. There's a little bit of a resemblance there. And here's a picture of my mother, and you can't read it, but it says Canadian Weds in Detroit. And so this is a picture of my mother at age 27. Getting married in Detroit, because of course she was educated in Canada, as was my uncles. And they, of course, and she was the only one that actually had a college education. My 2 uncles were not sent to college, but she was sent to college because my grandfather was worried that she wouldn't find a husband. As a Black woman and a Canadian, he was worried, and so he wanted her to be able to support herself. So she graduated from University of Toronto again in 1937, and came to Washington and worked at the Freedmen's Hospital, okay, which was started in the Reconstruction era. And she met my father there. So my kids, these are my 2 sons. This is my military son. This is Amal. This is Wendy. You've probably seen her running around church, chasing after this guy, okay, who is Caden, who is usually never going slowly, just always moving. And this is Omar, who we are trying to entice to come to church. And I think Sheila has been successful to get him to do a couple of classes. So they're both really terrific kids. And then my grandchildren are here. And I am the 4th generation in my family with a bachelor's degree. And actually I have several more degrees, but with a bachelor's degree. This is Omar, the one that's here in Rochester. And this is my military son with all in his fancy outfits, right? And these are his 3 kids. So my kids are the 5th generation of college graduates, and this one will be graduating soon. He's going to graduate in January of 2021, and this one may come out about the same time. They're all a year apart. And this is Brooke, who is a freshman in college now, and they're in Texas. And that's, you know who. And this is a picture of Barry's grandson, Barry's only grandson, who is in California. Barry is my current partner. And this is my Leeuw husband. All right. He was a Unitarian. I met him at First Universalist, and Beth married us. And this is a picture of Barry, who you've seen lurking around our church. He has a small congregation of humanist Jewish people, Beth Haskalah, and he can be seen at social justice stuff. And I'm sorry there's so much reflection. And you may not recognize him because he only gets into a suit about once every 2 years. And then I have 2 more pictures, and I couldn't figure out how to get them on the computer, so I ended up sending them by email the old-fashioned way. And this is my priest son. And I don't know if you could see him. I had a hard time trying to figure it out. Wearing his dress, he's an Episcopal priest in White Plains, New York. And sorry, this is so clunky, but this was the best that I could do. And those of you that know me know that email is not my friend. It is not my friend. Where is it? Oh, shoot. Now I can't find it. Darn it. Anyway, I had pictures of my 2 stepchildren. Okay. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much for listening. Unitarianism is very, very important in my life, and I would probably be lost without having connected with the tribe of Unitarians and Universalists in our community, even the ones that weren't so friendly in Detroit, and the Unitarians I've met across the country. So, thank you.